and still lost everything. Because the person who destroyed him wasn't a stranger.
On a Tuesday morning in March, Daniel Reyes opened an email that ended everything he'd spent 20 years building. He read it twice, then a third time. Then he picked up the phone and called a number that had been disconnected. 3 hours later, he was sitting in a parking lot outside a bank that no longer had his money in it, staring at a windshield, trying to understand how a man he'd known for 11 years, a man who'd stood next to him at his daughter's wedding, had just taken almost everything he owned. This is the story of how one signature, one handshake, and one blind spot cost a man everything he had, and the 2 years it took him to understand why. Daniel Reyes built his business the slow way. He started in 1998 with a used pickup truck and a small commercial contracting outfit, the kind that pours concrete and frames buildings for other people's dreams. By 2015, he had 40 employees, a fleet of trucks, and a reputation in his part of the state as a man whose word was better than most people's paperwork. He didn't cut corners. He paid his crews on time. When a supplier got into trouble, Daniel was the guy who floated them a loan without asking for interest. He'd built something real, and everyone around him knew it. In 2013, Daniel met a man named Marcus Whitfield at a Chamber of Commerce dinner. Marcus introduced himself as a financial consultant, the kind of guy who worked with contractors and family businesses to help them grow, protect their assets, and plan for retirement. He was polished. He knew the right people. He'd done work, or said he'd done work, for 2 other businessmen Daniel respected. He golfed at the same club. He went to the same church on Easter and Christmas. He had a firm handshake and a way of remembering the names of people's kids. For the first 2 years, Marcus didn't ask for anything. He gave advice. Good advice, mostly, the kind that made Daniel a little more money and cost him nothing. He helped Daniel restructure a loan. He introduced him to an accountant who saved him money on his taxes. Trust, in other words, was earned the old-fashioned way, slowly, and through small proofs that repeated themselves until they stopped being noticed as proof at all and just became the water Daniel swam in. There was one moment, back in 2014, that Daniel would replay in his head 1,000 times after everything fell apart. Marcus had asked him, almost offhand, whether Daniel had ever thought about what would happen to the business if something happened to him, an accident, a health scare, anything sudden. Daniel hadn't. Marcus suggested they set up something simple, a limited power of attorney, just for financial matters, just in case. Nothing that gave anyone control over the business day-to-day. Just a safety net. Daniel signed it without reading past the first page. Why would he? This was Marcus. Marcus had never once given him a reason not to trust him. By 2016, Marcus had become something like a silent partner in Daniel's financial life. He managed a portion of Daniel's retirement accounts. He had signing authority on one of the business's secondary accounts, the one used for equipment purchases and supplier payments. Daniel didn't check those accounts often. Why would he? Marcus sent him summaries every quarter, clean spreadsheets with numbers that always looked reasonable, always looked like they were going up. In hindsight, there were cracks. A supplier called once in 2017 asking why a payment was 3 weeks late, when Daniel knew for a fact the money had been sent. Marcus explained it as a banking delay, a processing error, and it was fixed within the week, or seemed to be. A friend of Daniel's, a man named Lewis who'd known Marcus socially for longer than Daniel had, mentioned once at a barbecue that he'd heard Marcus had gotten into some kind of dispute with a former client. Daniel asked Marcus about it directly. Marcus laughed it off. A misunderstanding, a client who didn't like hearing the truth about his own spending habits. Daniel believed him, because believing him was easier than not, and because nothing in 11 years had ever given him a real reason to doubt the man. The turning point came in the fall of 2019. Daniel's business was expanding into a second state, and it needed capital, more than the bank was willing to lend on the terms Daniel wanted. Marcus had a solution, a private investment group he worked with, individuals looking for exactly this kind of opportunity, secured against the business's equipment and, if needed, a portion of Daniel's personal assets. Marcus would structure the deal. Marcus would handle the paperwork. All Daniel had to do was sign. He signed. He didn't have his own attorney review it first, because Marcus was already handling his finances and it felt redundant, even insulting, to bring in someone new to check the man who'd been managing his money without a single problem for 6 years. For over a year, everything looked fine. The expansion moved forward. Payments to the investment group went out on schedule, at least according to the reports Daniel received. He was busy running 2 states' worth of operations and didn't think to ask why he'd never actually met anyone from this investment group in person. The email that arrived that Tuesday morning in March came from an attorney representing a group of investors Daniel had never heard of, informing him that the equipment liens on his business were being called in immediately, that his personal assets pledged as secondary collateral were now subject to seizure, and that the investment group Marcus had introduced him to 18 months earlier did not, in fact, legally exist in the way Marcus had represented it. Daniel called Marcus's cell phone. Disconnected. He drove to Marcus's office. Empty. The lease terminated 2 weeks earlier. He drove to Marcus's house. For sale. Closed the month before. What Daniel eventually pieced together, with the help of a forensic accountant and an attorney he hired far too late, was this. The power of attorney signed back in 2014 had never been the narrow, precautionary document Daniel believed it was. Buried in language he never read past the first page, it gave Marcus broad authority over financial decisions that Marcus had quietly expanded over the years through amendments Daniel had also signed without reading closely, always at moments when he was busy, always framed as routine paperwork. The secondary business account Marcus managed had been used, for years, to funnel money into ventures that existed only on paper. The investment group behind the 2019 expansion loan was Marcus himself, operating through a shell structure, lending Daniel his own diverted money back to him at interest, then using the loan documents Daniel signed to place liens on real assets once the paper trail got too complicated to keep hidden. By the time it was over, Daniel had lost his secondary business account entirely, roughly 60% of his retirement savings, and, after the liens were enforced, both his expansion property and a piece of equipment fleet valued at just under $2 million. The business survived, barely, reduced to something close to what it had been a decade earlier. His marriage strained under the weight of it for the better part of 2 years. He stopped sleeping through the night for what he later described as almost 18 months. Marcus Whitfield was never criminally charged. By the time investigators built a case, he had moved the bulk of what remained of the money through accounts in a jurisdiction that made prosecution functionally impossible, and he had, according to the last confirmed sighting anyone could offer Daniel, resettled somewhere on the Gulf Coast under a name that was legally his, but that none of his old friends had ever heard him use. Daniel filed a civil suit. He won a judgment. He has collected almost none of it. What Daniel rebuilt, he rebuilt slowly, the same way he'd built it the first time. One contract, one crew, one supplier relationship at a time. The business today is smaller than it was at its peak, but it is entirely his again, audited quarterly by an accountant he chose himself, with no one holding authority over a single account but him. When people ask him now what he'd tell someone in his position 11 years ago, before any of it started, he doesn't talk about Marcus. He talks about the document he signed in 2014 without reading past the first page. He talks about the quarterly summaries he never once cross-checked against the actual bank statements. He talks about how trust, once it's been earned honestly over years, becomes the very thing a person can no longer see clearly enough to question. He didn't lose everything to a stranger. He lost it to someone he let in.